Hi Joan.
Hi Eleanor, nice to be here.
Brilliant to have you here. Please can you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be interested in women at Cromford Mills?
Okay. Well, I was born and bred in Derby, so not very far away, and I went to a local girls' grammar school, Homelands, which is now closed, and then I went on to a women's college, and then for my career, I spent my whole career in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and that was where I first noticed that there was such a thing as discrimination against women, because having gone through with all women and no barriers as far as they were concerned at the schools and college, suddenly there were odd barriers being popped up, such as when I first joined, I was going to be doing a hard language, Polish, and then it was suddenly removed from me because the head of training thought I was a bit of a risk. I might get married, I might have children. I did both of those actually, and the Foreign Office's actual rules and regulations and child management of women's issues has improved enormously in all that time. It's a long time ago now. I was involved in that work though, both when I was in human resources, but also there was a board that the permanent secretary ran to look at women's issues and general equality issues. And then I also did some work from the Foreign Office in foreign policy aspects of women, particularly in encouraging conflict-affected countries to make better use of women's skills and better use of women's peacemaking capacities. And we managed to put together action plans, national action plans. That was a British initiative, which we took while I was running a department dealing with these things. And it was really exciting to see it take off with other countries, because you don't get things done usually if you don't write them down as plans. And it was great, it was all going on in New York, but it wasn't going on locally. When I retired, I also carried on this work with Gender Action for Peace and Security and for Peace Direct, which was a charity. Gender Action for Peace and Security carried on the work I'd been doing in the office. Peace Direct is a small charity which does a lot of work with people in conflict-affected countries to try and see what they really want to do. And they also have quite a few programmes that remind me of Cromford, because they involve women working in the textile business in various capacities, using their own choices to do that. And that's really what we're talking about, women making their own choices about what they do.
And how much do we know about women working in the mills and making those choices in the 18th century?
Well, this goes really directly to the issue of hidden histories, which is a big issue now amongst historians and academics generally. Many histories in the past, including in the early, quite a long time into the 20th century, were written from the perspective of politics and the big picture sort of history, which of course by and large involved men. And not many women. There were of course powerful women, Queen Elizabeth I, people like that, and many who played a role in history, not surprisingly, but they're not always as easy to get at as Queen Elizabeth I. So there's a lot more work done these days by social historians, or historians of social issues, that's a better way of describing it, on issues around data, looking for material on women specifically. And that means looking perhaps, instead of at formal documents, government documents or something like that, or records of town councils or whatever, that they're looking at letters, diaries, the sorts of formats that you might well capture material that tells you about women's lives. And there's been quite a lot of research done on it, a mixture of real feminist work, looking at power structures and things that involved women or didn't involve women, but also looking at these sorts of sources. They have to do that because if you start looking at the traditional things like the censuses, for example, you immediately come into problems because women's contribution to the labour force was not really recorded properly. Adam Smith in the 18th century said, labour is only productive if added value to a material object, if it is an added value to a material object or is creating a storable commodity. So what that really means is it doesn't matter if you're working as a servant, if you're working as somebody who's helping part of the process earlier on, all that matters is the top end of the work, by which they meant by and large men's work. So statistics were not really very helpful when trying to assess what women did. The 19th century brought in the census, of course, But that itself was problematic because it varied from each 10-year period to the next in how it recorded women's work. So, for example, the 1831 census told the enumerators who were doing the work of the census, women should be recorded as having no occupation or listed with the husband. The 1841 census said the profession of the wife or daughters need not be recorded. The 1851 finally mentioned that women, whether at home or in the house, could be recorded, but not if doing domestic duties. The 1881 census went backwards, and it said all women that means, should be categorised as unemployed. Now, this is not reflecting what was going on in society. The data also ignored completely, for these censuses, part-time work and casual work. And that was in the rules for the enumerators. So women were typically defined as dependents, whatever their productive function. And those women who worked in the formal economy were not necessarily included in the statistics. Married women recorded as wives, and mention of their work and wages was pretty rare. So these variations in the census from time to time makes it difficult to pick up data. And there's a good example of that in a village in Cheshire, a small town in Cheshire, the name of which I can't remember at the moment, where the census recorded about 20 landladies in that town, but the business directory, where you'd go to if you wanted to actually get a landlady, recorded about 80. So there were actually 60 women somehow not being recorded in this data. And also there was a problem with the mixture of, this comes into the mills very much, and the mixture of women's work tended to be much more informal, not necessarily full-time, and maybe 2 or 3 jobs at the same time. I mean, don't mean literally the same time, but going on during the course of a week, you might have 2 or 3 things. You might be doing some laundry for people, you might be minding children, you might be picking up stuff in the field behind your farmer husband. So you had a patchwork of work. And actually, if you think about it, that's often how it works nowadays too. People often they work at Tesco's for part of the week, they look after their children and the neighbours' children, maybe that's very informal economy, and they maybe do some gardening next door, all sorts of things like that. People do a variety of jobs, particularly women do a variety of jobs. So it's quite difficult to pin down what happened to women. But Susan Steinbach, who's an American who's written a very good history of women in the Industrial Revolution, has a very good quote about this. She says, the female textile worker, the mill worker, was the archetypal worker during industrialisation, which could not have happened without women. So what it's saying there is that women were absolutely vital to the Industrial Revolution, and yet we have very little data about them, so it's hard.
How did life change for women who worked at the mills?
Well, women were already spinning, hand spinning, very much a woman's job. And women were sought by Richard Arkwright here. He actually went out of his way to advertise for women and children to come and work here. And some people think that's because they were bound to be cheaper. I've heard that said so many times since starting volunteering at Cromford. Or the women would have been employed because they were cheaper. That wasn't actually the case. People think that's the case until you look at the data. And here there is some data in a variety of books written mostly in the second half of the 20th century, one written as early as 1930s by a wonderful lady called Ivy Pinchbeck. I love her name. At the time that he was looking for spinners, people to come here and work his spinning machines, women spinners, hand spinners, were a high wage part of the economy. And the reason for that is that there were massive yarn shortages to make cloth. It was a period when people liked to dress. If you think of Jane Austen, they were all dressed up in fancy gear all the time. That required people to do the spinning of the cloth. So hand spinning was quite a well-paid profession at that point. So it wasn't just that. He probably wanted them because, for 2 reasons. One is because they had experience in handling yarn, not weaving, but handling yarn when it was being spun. And secondly, they had children, and he wanted the children to do the less trained labour. I would think it's not really fair to call people unskilled labour in the mills myself, but that's one of the ways people talk about them. But that's certainly an issue for women. They were skilled, and they were skilled at looking after children as well. And so that's one of the changes in the lifestyle. That's talking about background, sorry. And then changes in their lifestyle. Well, if they were spinners already, they had good background, but now suddenly they had to learn how to do what they did on machines. For the first time, they didn't do it at home. They were outside the house. Now, they might have been outside the house doing other things, but spinning was traditionally done at home, with all the family getting involved with the preparation of the cotton. So they were outside, but for hours on end, 12 hours at a time in a shift here. We're not sure whether they worked the night shift here. In fact, we don't have much detailed facts about Cromford Mills, the way the women worked here at Cromford Mills. We have some of the other mills in the area. But basically, Arkwright was running 2 shifts of 12 hours morning, so it was working 24 hours a day except for Sundays. And I would imagine that to start with, those women must have tried working night work, probably. They had therefore to make different childcare arrangements, because usually they managed their brood of children to whatever work they were all doing, because they were all working in those days too. For children, for the poor, this was the rural poor you're talking about, who really were poor, and so they would be going out with their father as well as their mother to help in the fields, to do with lead mines, sometimes as lead miners, but mostly at the other end when the lead was being, with the rock with the lead, it was being ratcheted up. So Mum was in charge of all that. So there were changes in the way they related to their families altogether as well. But family income would have gone up dramatically, even though they were well paid. They were better paid here to start with. At the end of the 18th century, they were better paid. And the women's income would have been the one that brought them above the poverty level. Dad might have earned enough to just about feed the family, but for better clothes, for sort of commodities in the house, this is where the women's wages might have gone. The conditions in the mills were not great. More coughs and colds probably, working together in big groups, but also cotton lung, where the cotton that was in the air was ingested into the lung and became infected. They had to long hours standing all the time, and if they wanted to sit down, they didn't have much chance, quite frankly. On the other hand, they'd be getting, as I say, better clothes and better food. There were still opportunities, as far as we can see, for doing this informal economy thing, because we have records of wages where people are paid different amounts for different amounts of cotton produced. And that leads you to think that probably was part-time working, some part-time working, some full-time working. So that might have still happened, where you went home a bit earlier or whatever. Certainly the Bakewell Mill, which was run by Richard Arkwright Jr., had records showing exactly that sort of thing. They would have had to deal differently with their husbands, probably, because they were at home much more doing the weaving in Cromford. That's what Arkwright advertised for. Weavers with large families, as well as women and children, they amount to the same thing. And the weavers were at home, and therefore they would have had to keep an eye out for the children more than they had in the past, the men, that is. There might have been status issues too. Women in those periods were, and still are to some extent, the guardians of respectability in families. That's one of the ways social historians describe it. So they were the ones who stopped their children running riot, and when their husband came home too drunk, they dealt with that and that sort of thing. So maybe that role was harder if you were out of the house for 12 hours a day. But on the other hand, single women would have had a better time perhaps, because they could often carry on working into their quite old age for that period, if they were working at the mills more independently from their family, because as we all know, if you were women like Jane Austen's women, a lot of them were poor but had to rely on their brothers if their father had died, or their uncles or whatever, to provide their income. These women were poor women, but they probably had more independence than those social middle class ones. Last bit on this one, yeah, they had more liberation probably than they had had before, even though they weren't downtrodden. And as I said, perhaps better for the single and widowed. And the wages were good, but I don't think they actually saw their own wages. They probably just went into the family pot. And it may be that they gained value in their own eyes by being able to get involved in formal learning at the mill, and that might have given them more status in their own eyes, which is important anyway for women moving into that direction.
One last question. Were women paid the same as men?
This is one that's really hard to judge because the data is quite difficult to get at, but there's quite a lot of wage books, not again for Cromford, but for the Belper Mills, the Strutt Mills in Belper, for the Bakewell Mill that Richard Arkwright Jr. ran, for the mills at Mellor, which Arkwright Jr.'s friend ran, but which was very much subsidised by Arkwright Jr. So there's quite a lot of those sorts of data, but not for Cromford itself. And it's true that a lot of women were still probably earning bits and pieces here and there as well as working in the mills. But the pay at the mills at the beginning stayed high. And as far as we can see, there was very little difference between what a woman supervisor in a mill might have been earning compared to her husband who was down the lead mine. In fact, she might even have been earning slightly more depending on how good he was as a lead miner and how much he worked. So probably in the early days there was a reasonable equity, and Arkwright himself definitely paid well. We know that because he needed badly to attract workers. There were only 100 people in Cromford when he came in, and so he would have paid good wages, and he did pay good wages compared to the people around. When he came in there were only 100 in Cromford, but by the time he died there were over 1,500 workers working for Arkwright. So he kept bringing people in, both from other villages but also literally to live in Cromford when he built houses. So that was pretty good. When the 19th century begins, and this is something I don't get into too much because it's not the Arkwright period, the Arkwright senior period, but it is true that by the 19th century the wages were moving across and men were earning more. They changed jobs as well. They got the women to do the weaving on big machinery, and they themselves moved into the spinning machinery, especially as it got more complex with the mule. So gradually women were paid less. And then there is a wonderful court case which always makes me smile when you think about the continuing battles about women's pay. Up to that date, the record says, it was customary in the cotton industry to pay people the same, whether male or female, for the work they did. If it was the same work, they did the same rate. However, a master of a mill, of course, the phrase that they used in those days, decided not to pay his women workers the same money. And one of them took the case to the local court, the district courts, and said this wasn't fair. And the court looked into it, and through that process, gradually, Parliament changed the relevant acts to make it quite clear that they were explicitly extending to women the same wage as the men. And here's the quotation: to obtain their price under the same pain and penalties as the men. So you got paid the same, but you could get sacked in the same way. That's fair enough, really. That's probably what most women would like to see now around the world. So that's my take on women in the mill, and probably women worldwide. Get paid the same for doing the same work and then take the same responsibility. And so there you go.
Thank you, Joan.
You're very welcome.